Okay, I think we'll start here. Mr. Pintus was born in Berlin, Germany. He and his wife and children came to the USA in 1951 after surviving the Holocaust. First settling in Kansas, he moved to Des Moines in 1964, where he joined the Iowa Health System as a chaplain, a position he held until 2007. He retired as chaplain emeritus and is still active ministering to Jewish patients in the hospitals. He also became a mediator in the Iowa 5th District Small Claims Court and serves on the staff of the local temple in Des Moines as assistant to the rabbi. He is a board member of the DMARC.
DMARC, Des Moines Area Religious Council.
Okay, Des Moines Area Religious Council. Thank you. Married to his wife Eva for 61 years. They have 62 now. They have 5 children, 10 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. In 2004, he received the Torchbearer Award from his synagogue for outstanding service to temple and secular community, and was again honored last August by Governor Culver as an outstanding Iowan. Mr. Pintus is a sought-after speaker on the Holocaust and has spoken to many schools, universities, and churches all over the Midwest. Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I feel very honored to be here with you today to talk about a subject that happened in the last century, in the middle of the last century, and which shook the world, and we still feel the results of it now. And I'm talking about the Holocaust. There are many stories about the Holocaust. We all perhaps differ a little bit, but there is a red thread going through the theme as to the brutality that was exercised upon a whole segment of the population in Europe. And it was difficult to understand how a cultured people could stoop so low as to declare other human beings as subhumans and kill them. Well, I experienced the Holocaust from the beginning of my life. I was born in 1927 in Berlin to an upper-class Jewish family. My grandfather owned a very large steel factory, and my dad was a CEO, and I was the only son and heir apparent to all that wealth. And I was brought up as a maid and a cook and a chauffeur, so I must say that probably the first 5 years of my life were really uneventful, other than growing up in a loving home. But then things began to change. In 1932, some of you might have talked to your grandparents about the Great Depression. Well, that spilled over to Europe, and Germany especially had a lot of problems with unemployment and soup lines and everything else. And the weak German Republic, the democracy, had to call for new elections. And there were 35 parties that entered into the election. You think we got problems with 2 parties? I think there was 35 of them. And one of the parties was the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party, to us known as the Nazis. And at the head of the Nazi party was a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm sure you have read about him, heard about him, but just briefly reviewing, Hitler was born in Austria. He joined the German army in World War I. He was wounded and decorated for bravery. But then after the war, he became greatly disenchanted with the rest of the world because Germany had lost the war. And he blamed primarily the international Jewish conspiracy who had brought that upon Germany. And in 1923, he joined a small group in Munich, Germany, a small group of radicals. They even went so far as to try to overthrow the Bavarian government. He was arrested, sent to prison. And while in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And unfortunately, it was not a bestseller. If people had read the book at that time, might be they would have known what was lying ahead for them. No, it wasn't. But Hitler spelled out exactly in that book what he foresaw for a greater Germany, greater Europe, and especially in regard to the Jews to be eliminated from the country. Well, in 1932, the Nazis won the election. They won not by a revolution or bloodshed, but they won by the ballot box. The German people elected him. They liked Hitler's program. And I still remember the next day when Hitler was installed as the prime minister of the new Germany. My mother had taken me to a famous avenue in Berlin called Unter den Linden, under the linden tree. And that is an avenue that houses the embassies and the castle, the palace, the opera houses, all kind of cultural institutions. And Hitler was standing, and it was getting dark outside. He was standing on the balcony of the palace, reviewing the troops in front of him of brown shirts and SS black uniforms Hitler used, and German police and everybody else in power. And it was really an eerie sight and sound when you heard thousands of boots beating the pavement in cadence and carrying torches to illuminate the evening. And one had a feeling like the opera of Richard Wagner's Götterdämmerung, that something had happened to the German Democratic Republic, that democracy was ending, and that a new dictatorship was in the making. Well, as Jews, we experienced that immediately. Next day, papers published all kind of edicts against Jews, primarily kicking them out of public life. Jews were not allowed to teach or go to university or colleges, or doctors were not allowed to treat Germans anymore, only Jewish patients. And there was just a concentrated effort to make Jewish people into second-class citizens. They also lost their citizenship, so they really had no status living in Germany. Well, I went to school during that time, and I immediately found out what it is like to be out of a Jewish family. I had to sit in the back of the classroom all by myself. I was not allowed to participate in any activities, nor go on any outings or trips or whatsoever, and I did not intermingle with any of the other kids. And I was 6 years old, and I couldn't quite understand why. After all, I looked like the rest of the kids. I spoke the same language. I had to say the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of the school day, and I had to give the Hitler salute. So where was I different? Yet I was. And it really brought to mind when I went to school in the morning or went home at night, that the class bully was waiting for me, and I got a bloody nose and a black eye. And when I went to my mother complaining, and she went to the principal, he said, well, I can't help you, you're Jews. So I was not only outside the laws of the state, but also the rules of the school system. Well, in 1935, an important event happened. And that is when the Nazis established who's Jewish and who is not. And we have to remember that to be a Jew was not a religious issue, not at all. It was a racial issue. The genes that you had inside of you. The Nazis claimed that Jewish people were of an inferior race, and so that's what it determined. And they passed a set of laws called the Nuremberg laws after the city of Nuremberg, which spelled out who's Jewish. And if you had 4 Jewish grandparents and 2 Jewish parents, you were automatically considered Jewish. But the same happened if you had only 3 Jewish grandparents, 1 non-Jewish. You still were considered fully Jewish. But what about those who had only 2 Jewish grandparents and 2 Jewish parents, 2 non-Jewish grandparents and 1 Jewish parent, 1 non-Jewish parent? Those were considered half-Jews, Mischlinge, mixtures. And the Germans recognized that somehow these people had half of their blood being that precious Aryan blood that they adored, and the other was a damnable Jewish blood. So I could never quite figure out if they would cut me open this way or that way, which part of my body would have the Jewish blood and which part would have my Gentile blood, and so on. But they came up with an amazing solution. They said if these half-Jews were baptized in the Christian faith, they would be counted a little more towards the Aryan side than the Jewish side, like 51-49%. And my parents found out about it, and by the way, I have to mention that I am a half-Jew, that my father was Jewish, but my mother wasn't. And my parents heard about the laws coming forth and took me before a Lutheran minister in Berlin, and I was sprinkled with some holy water and baptized into the Christian faith. Now, there were no angels rejoicing in heaven, nor bells ringing, or whatever. It was strictly an act on the part of my parents to allow me to go to grade school at least 8 years. That was the maximum allowed for half-Jews. Well, in 1936, the Nazis put on the Olympic Games in Berlin. There was one great American Olympic athlete who really outshone all the rest of them. Anybody know who that was?
Jesse Owens.
Right. Just this wonderful black African American athlete. He was so good that Hitler refused to shake his hand because he was black. Well, anyway, the Nazis wanted to leave really a good impression upon the world, and so they removed any signs pertaining Jews, like Jews are not permitted here, Jews are not welcome, Jews get out, Jews are devils, and all this kind. Those signs were all removed. And so the people from all over the world came to Berlin, and they looked around, and I must say, the Germans really had prepared for the Olympic Games. Berlin was decorated to the hills with banners and everything else. So the people from the world who came and said, boy, the Nazis aren't really that bad, you know, they seem to be doing something. Well, there was a contest going on for the young people. And the contest was that you have a little black book and a pencil, and you stand on the street corner, and whenever you heard somebody walking by with a different language or an accent and so on, go up to them, introduce yourself, and ask them if they would write their name and their hometown into your little book. And you could win a prize for so many signatures. I don't remember what it was, but anyhow, I was a kid. I wanted to do the same, so I stood at the street corner with my little black book. There was a tall policeman standing next to me. He must have been at least 7 foot tall because I was such a little shrimper. And look at him, what an impressive figure. I mean, he had this beautiful uniform on that all the Germans liked. His sleeve shows that he spoke 3 languages fluent. He had red cheeks and a Kaiser Wilhelm mustache and a big smile, and he really could have been everybody's grandpa. So, being half German really with my other blood, I want to be sure I'm doing the right thing. So I went up to him and I said, "Sir, is it okay if I collect some signatures around here?" And he stepped up to me and put his hand on my head and said, "Oh, certainly, my boy, go right ahead." And then suddenly his smile disappeared, he stepped back, he looked very stern and said, "Unless you're a Jew." And again it was brought to me that somehow I was different, that I wasn't the same. Well, the restriction on Jews continued. Jews were forbidden to own electrical equipment like toasters or radios or anything electric. They were not allowed to move cars or bicycles or any transportation. They were limited from using the public transportation system. There were all kinds of limitations to keep Jews out of the public life. They were allowed only a certain amount of hours to be out shopping during the day. And there were certain areas in Berlin that were completely off limits to them. Well, the real Holocaust, I guess, began in 1938. When one night the Nazis created an upheaval against the Jews, which is now known as the Kristallnacht, the night of the glass, the Kristallnacht. What had happened? 2 days before, a young Jewish man in Paris had killed a minor German embassy official out of anger that his parents, his young man's parents, were to be deported from Germany to Poland. And in his misplaced anger, he did that deed. But the Nazis took the full propaganda value. They said not only this young man, this Jew, did that, but all Jews are responsible equally. And they assessed a big fine, money fine, on all Jews in Germany, plus the instructions that they had to give up any valuables like gold, silver, pearls, and so on, had to be turned into the nearest police precinct. And on November the 9th, the rumor mill in the Jewish community in Berlin already was going that something was terribly going to happen. And my dad decided not to stay home to avoid arrest. And he went down into the streets and then boarded a subway, and he traveled around the subway, which goes around in a circle in Berlin for 24 hours. And my mother and I were at home in our apartment when there was suddenly a knock at the door, and there were 3 SS men in their black uniform and one in civilian clothes who said he's from the Gestapo, the secret police. And when my mother asked, "What are you here for?" they said, "We came to arrest the Jew Pintus," which was my dad. And she said, "He's not here." And they became extremely angry, pushed their way into our apartment, pulled out the drawers out of cabinets, upset the contents on the ground, stepped on it, took out their knives, slashed the furniture, and did as much damage as they could, while my mother and I were sitting in a corner, deadly afraid of what would happen to us. Well, they did leave us alone. But they went to a little apartment next door, which was occupied by a Jewish lady. I've never forgotten her name, Fräulein Meyer. Fräulein Meyer was a lady in her 50s. She was single. She was a very private person. We didn't know much about her life, really. All we knew is that she was a collector of porcelain statues, those Hummel figurines, which even at that time had quite a bit of value. When the Nazis broke down the door to her apartment, they broke every piece that she had collected, and she was badly beaten. They left. My mother went over there after a little while to check up on Fräulein Meyer. She was lying on the floor dying. She had taken an overdose of sleeping pills because she couldn't endure the shame that had befallen upon her. Well, next morning, my mother took me down into the streets. We used to have a little Jewish shoemaker across the street, a little old fella. Everybody was his friends. The kids loved her because she always had candies. And the rest of the neighbors were customers and so on. But even his business was totally destroyed. The window was broken out, the glass scattered all over the sidewalk, hence the name Crystal Knight of the Glass. And the shoes that he was working on were all scattered over the sidewalk. And he was sitting at the curb, badly bleeding from the beating that he had received from the Nazis. And you know, all his friends and neighbors were standing around in silence. There wasn't a single person that would go up to that old man and try to stop his bleeding. My mother took me then to a famous avenue in Berlin, Kurfürstendamm, which is the Fifth Avenue of Berlin, with shops and theaters and so on. And the same thing had happened there. Jewish establishments were totally destroyed. Yellow graffiti all over accusing Jews to be devils. Merchandise scattered all over the sidewalks. And Jews were hunted like animals because they had nowhere to go. The Berlin police were just standing by silent without taking any actions. Then my mother took me to a little street off that avenue. There was a beautiful synagogue. My parents had worshipped there, and it was a beautiful place. And that synagogue was on fire, just like 200 others all over Germany. The Nazis had set the torch to those House of God. And I still remember there was a fireman standing close by a truck with his hose in his hand. And tears were running down his eyes because he was not allowed to do his job by putting out the fire. He was only there to protect the buildings surrounding the synagogue so they wouldn't catch on fire. It was a hectic day. The Germans said, oh, it wasn't by the party or the police or the government. It was a spontaneous response by the German people against the Jews. Well, that was also the time when my dad finally decided he would leave Germany. He never wanted to because he was a very loyal German, as he called himself, of Jewish faith. He had served in the First World War, was decorated also for bravery. Never thought the Nazis or Hitler would do anything to the established German Jews. After all, we have been over 500 years in that same area. But he was wrong. And so he finally decided, hey, let's leave. And it showed how little interest the world had to help these Jewish people. England had closed its doors because of the conflict in Palestine, oil and so on. There were more Jews getting there. Even you might have heard about the ship to St. Louis. It was a ship full of Jewish immigrants, went to Cuba, and Cuba refused to accept them, and then they went to New York Harbor. President Roosevelt said, no, we won't accept it. The ship had to go back to Europe, and eventually all these Jews ended up in concentration camp and died. Well, there was a country in Europe that thought, at least let's take care of the children. My parents heard about it, and that little country was Holland. Holland was willing to take children out of Jewish families, put them into some foster homes until the parents could leave and then call for them later on. And so from one day to the next, I was 11 years old, I was put on a children's train with thousands of others. And we had to say goodbye to our parents, not knowing if we would ever see them again. And when the train moved towards the German-Dutch border and came to a halt, I still remember the compartment door opened, and the German border guard, again in a splendid uniform and so on, just took one look at us, spit at us and said, "Bah, Jews, good riddance," and slammed the door shut. And then the train moved on, and 10 minutes later the door opened again, and there was another border guard, not in a flashy uniform, but with a smile on his face. And he brought us candy and welcomed us. He was a Dutch border guard. And for the first time, I felt what it meant to be free, not to be afraid that something would happen to me any day of my life. Well, I was put into a Dutch family who had a son the same age as I am, and I went to school with him, and I was allowed to participate in the school life and to sit wherever I needed to sit. And in fact, I even had to go to the principal a couple of times for some fractions, but that's all right. At least I was part of it. Well, unfortunately, that didn't last very long. Those of you who studied European history in World War II know that the Nazis overran Holland, Belgium, and France on May 10th, 1940. And with that, the laws concerning Jews were also applied to those occupied countries. And for one reason or the other, I was ordered to return back to Berlin where my parents were. And fortunately, or unfortunately, they were not able to leave Germany, and the war broke out and the paperwork wasn't completed, so the borders were closed. And so we were reunited for a very short time. Until one morning I woke up, I went into the living room, and my mother was lying on the couch, dying. She too had taken an overdose of sleeping pills because she couldn't take it anymore. And with the Aryan part of my family gone, my dad and I became subject to arrest. And it wasn't very long thereafter that I was arrested and taken to a railroad station in Berlin and loaded on a freight train with hundreds of others just like me. And the train moved on in a direction we didn't know because our cars were sealed. For the next 2 days we didn't have any food or any way to relieve ourselves or do anything. But after 2 days we ended up in Western Germany in a very secretive location. And what it was, an abandoned salt mine, 1,500 feet under the ground. The Nazis wanted to use the facilities to build underground ammunition factories so they could produce even during the bomb war. And so for the next 3 years, we had to work in that mine 8 to 10 hours a day and load big boulders of salt that were dynamited out of the walls and to build that all on cast iron dollies. And we didn't have any tools or anything. We had to lift them, which weighed between 50 and 70 pounds. And for a 15-year-old, it was extremely hard work. But you know, you wouldn't dare to get sick or give up, because we knew very well the minute you couldn't work anymore, you would be sent to Buchenwald, which was the closest concentration gas camp. We didn't want to have that happen. Well, the only companion that we really had and knew was hunger. We were hungry all the time. After all, estimating today how much food we got, probably between 800 and 1,000 calories. And to do all that heavy work with that little bit of food was not easy, but we somehow survived. And I remember one night I was lying in a barracks. Our barracks were about this size here, with 45 to each barrack. We had bunk beds 3 tiers high. You might have seen some pictures of prisoners looking out of that. Well, one night, all we had basically was a straw mattress and an army blanket and our prison uniform, which was so saturated with salt, and you know salt holds the moisture, and so it was constantly wet, that we had that feeling we never dried out. But one night I woke up and I had to follow nature's call. Well, the way you did that, just step outside and relieve yourself. That's what I did. And when I did, I saw a truck parked behind our barracks. And the tailgate was open, and I looked in there, and lo and behold, there were some potatoes lying on the truck bed. And I quickly scooped up some of them, put under my shirt, and then went inside and hid them under my mattress. Now, if I had been found out to steal government property, I can tell you I wouldn't be here to talk about it, because that meant the death penalty immediately. But I didn't care. I was lying awake all night long, fantasizing of what I would do with those potatoes. And next morning when I woke up, and I sliced them, and we had a little cast iron stove to give us some heat. And I put those slices on there and I baked them. No, I really burned them. But I have to tell you, I love McDonald's French fries. They don't compare a bit with those potatoes at that time. Because for one brief moment, I was not hungry anymore. Well, the war went on. We had no knowledge of it because we were totally in a secret location. We had no newspaper or mail or radio or anything else. The only sign that the war was still going on were the American bombers that flew across our camp every hour of the day, and the British at night. And I know they brought a lot of death and destruction to the German people. But to us, there was a sign of hope. Hope that somebody out in this world was still fighting for our cause. And that happened in 1945 in April. The American armies were about 80 to 100 miles away from our camp. And we could hear the war noises, the rumbling in the back. And one night, it was a very dark night, the Nazis brought in some trucks and ordered everybody into those trucks to be relocated to Buchenwald's concentration camp. And two friends and I had found a small gate at the side of the camp that was normally guarded by an SS guard with a German Shepherd dog and electric wiring. But we thought at least we see where it is, and during that night and in all the confusion, we went to it, and lo and behold, the guard had taken off, and the electricity was cut off because the British had bombed the power plant before. And so we were able to escape out of the camp. And we ran across a field into a nearby forest. And for the next 8 days, we were hiding out in the forest, covering ourselves with branches and leaves, eating grass and bark of the tree, and only at night crawling out to the nearby farm field and digging up some potatoes that farmers normally leave there. But in the meantime, we were in no man's land. We saw the bullets fly over our head because the retreating Nazis were on one side and the advancing Americans were on the other. But after 8 days, somehow the war noise subsided and we couldn't last much longer. So we went to the outskirts of the forest and we saw something we'd never seen before. A little box with 4 wheels on it, a white star on it. Somebody told us later on that's called an automobile, the Jeep. But we had never seen a contraption like that. But in that contraption or automobile was a soldier of a different uniform. And so we assumed that this must be an American. And we ran toward him, and he was as surprised as we were because we had our dirty prison uniforms, we were unshaven, we We were really a miserable bunch of human beings we were there. But we didn't care. We danced around the Jeep out of joy. And we couldn't have cared less who that soldier was. If it was Private Joe Smith or General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, we couldn't have cared less. All we cared that here was a man that came across the ocean for 5,000 miles to set us free. And that's where our freedom began. We spent 3 months in Western Germany, courtesy of the American army that could not understand why we couldn't eat their food because it was too rich. But after 3 months, the 2 other fellows and myself, who were also from Berlin, and they were brothers, decided, let's go back to Berlin. Let's see if any of our families still survive. And that was not an easy feat, because you might recall that Berlin was surrounded by the Russian zone. And there was no transportation trains or anything like it. We had to walk. And the Russians weren't very kind to see 3 young men walking down there. They thought we were probably escaped German prisoners and arrested us. But we made it. We got to the outskirts of Berlin, and we said goodbye to each other, because they lived in a different part of Berlin than I did. And I moved on to where I lived before I was arrested. And every at home was in nothing but rubble after all the Battle of Berlin had taken its toll. But our house, the apartment house, was still standing. There was no glass in the windows or big holes in the side of the walls, but at least it was still standing. There was a grocery store a little ways off, and a long line of people waiting for their daily rations. When suddenly a person broke out of that line, came running toward me. It was my dad. He too had survived the Holocaust. We were reunited in the burned out streets of Berlin. Well, unfortunately, like so many Holocaust survivors, he wouldn't talk about his experience. I can't tell you anything about it. And he died very shortly thereafter. And that left me as an 18-year-old young kid. And I was so full of anger. I was angry with myself for surviving this whole mess, which is typical for survivors. I was angry with other people for what they did to me and to my family, because my dad had told me that our whole family was wiped out, cousins and uncles and so on. But I was uppermost angry with God. How could a loving and merciful, caring God permit those atrocities? And I still remember I had rented a room from an elderly lady, and one night I woke up and I began to think, Peter, what are you going to do with your life? After all, you haven't completed your schooling, you don't have a job, you don't have families, you don't have friends, you really don't have anybody. Besides that, you are so down and angry. And you know, it occurred to me that if I continue in the same vein as that, I'd be as dead as the rest of my family. Not physically, but emotionally. And I didn't want to give the Nazis their last victim. So next morning I decided to go out into the open and see if I couldn't find some people that had friendly faces, that didn't resent me, and so on. And I found out, hey, there were people. And I was especially lucky a couple of years later to find my wife, married now 62 years too. But you know, it also came to mind that often we pay so much attention to numbers. We say 6 million Jews, 5 million others, other undesirable. That's staggering. We look at Haiti, we look at Darfur. Those numbers are staggering. But what I was reminded of, that each one of these people went to the gas chamber as an individual. You know, there was no comfort to stand naked in a room, knowing that in about 20 seconds you'd be gassed. You had to deal with your own angst, your sweat and gore and blood. in all this. And so perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Holocaust is to pay more attention to those individuals that don't seem to fit in our society. I always talk to high school kids and I say, you know, there's usually a kid that doesn't quite fit in, perhaps a little too heavy, has Coke glasses, you know, not too bright and so on, never gets selected for any teams or anything. And I challenged the students. I say, why don't you go up to that kid, put your arm around it and say, hey, come on, I want you to meet my friends. I want you to be a part of us. Because every child wants to be accepted and be someone. And you know, there's an old Jewish saying, if you save one person, it is as you have saved the whole world. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
The last chance. Not all at once. What do you want to know?
How to meet your wife?
How? I met her at the Boy Scouts. When I was in Holland, I was a Boy Scout. And I like Boy Scouting. And so after the war, of course, the Boy Scouts had been eliminated in Germany during the Hitler time. They were all turned into Hitlers. But after the war, I found another two fellows who were also interested to re-establish the Boy Scouts in Berlin. And we had to get a license from all four commanders, Allied commanders. But we did. But we had a shortage of troop leaders, adults, because most of the men were still prisoner of war in Russia. And so lo and behold, God forbid, we had to use women. And my wife was in the beauty salon one day, and we put an ad in the paper. And she saw that ad in the magazine, and she came to my next training session. Well, she was a nurse, and nurses looked like Catholic sisters at that time. Not much to look at it. So. Anyhow, she came, and she was the only one that would talk back to me. And I said, I don't need her. Nothing but trouble. But 2 months later, we met at a Mardi Gras party. And she had come with her date, and I came with mine. And she looked gorgeous. She had a dress on, and her hair was long and all that. And somehow we hit it off, and we went home together. And I think my date is still sitting there waiting. Anyhow, that's how we met. And about 6 weeks later, we got engaged, and 3 months later, we got married. And we were the only ones at our wedding. And in fact, the judge had to call a couple of policemen to witness our vows. And then at night, she had baked a beautiful cake, and we had our wedding dinner together, just the two of us. And I said we weren't too tired to go to bed after that. I mean, it wasn't an exhausting day. So many wedding days are. But it was very interesting with the wedding cake. As I said, my wife was a nurse in the hospital, and she baked the cake in the sterilizer oven, the surgical unit, because we had no stove or anything. And I was lying on a surgical bed taking a nap. Now, can you see that today in the hospital? For me to lie on a surgical bed and she had the cake in the sterilizer. So it was very eventful. We have good memories. Anything you want to know?
Did you ever stay in touch with your family extended from Holland, or?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I corresponded with my brother there, but he died a couple of years ago. So there's nobody left of that family.
What about the two guys that you traveled with?
Well, you know, war is a funny thing. People lose connections. And so did we. After a while, we didn't visit anymore. I heard that one of them became a Supreme Court judge in Germany, and the other one had a big flowering business. But no, we haven't. And that's typical for wars, you know, families break up, friendships break up. Everybody goes their own way. So it's too bad, but on the other hand, it's part of the journey. Yes?
Did you go back and get some more schooling after?
Yeah, I went to the Academy of Architecture and Engineering, got my degree. And when I came over to the United States and we settled in Kansas first, they wouldn't recognize and said you have to go back 1 year for a degree. And we already had 2 kids and I didn't want to do that, so I let architecture go by the wayside.
We might not have much time for this, but you brought up your anger against God. How
Right.
did you resolve it, or how?
Yeah, it took me quite some time to come to grips with that. But it finally occurred to me that perhaps God couldn't have done anything about it. And that had led me to my belief that God is really powerless and not powerful. Powerless in that regard that he has given us a free choice to choose good or evil, life or death. And if he would interfere in that, then he would not be a loving God, but prejudicial. He would say, well, I help this one, but I don't help that one. So I believe that God sits in heaven and cries tears over what we do to each other. I always find it so ridiculous when people pray, Lord, give us peace in our time. Ridiculous, God already has done that. We are the ones that have to make peace. Or feed the hungry, God. Well, that is ridiculous. There's enough food in this world. But we are the one that needs to feed the hungry. So the responsibility comes to us, and I'm a very strong believer in the concept of being co-creators with God, which means that God has made all this, that I do believe, but that I'm responsible to preserve it, and you are responsible to preserve this world. It's our choices, and I can't blame it on God or anything. I'm the one that has to do the work. And that took away my anger from God. I began to understand God and said, I really feel sorry for him. You know, we have made such a good thing, and look what we turned out to be toward each other. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Got a couple more minutes.
No, don't be bashful. I answer any question you have.
Were you tattooed?
I mean,
Were you tattooed?
no, half-truths were not tattooed yet. Also, documents were found that it was in the making. So if the war had lasted another 6 months, it probably would have been. I have not been tattooed. My dad was, but I wasn't. Yes, sir.
What happened to your family's steel factory after the Holocaust started?
Yeah. Well, it was in Berlin, and it was in the eastern part of Berlin. It was taken, well, it was after the Nazis took it over, nationalized it. But after the war, the Russians came in, they didn't recognize any compensation or anything for it. And too many years went by, we were over here already, and I don't really have any documents to claim ownership, so might be it's still sitting there. So what? I don't want to be in factory work.
Have you gone back and visited all of it?
Yeah, I went back to Berlin about 8 times because I had a good friend over there. And somehow, I don't want to live over there, don't misunderstand me. I love Des Moines, Iowa, I'm crazy. But Berlin is a very exciting city. You know, it's a metropolitan area with a lot of culture and so on. In fact, I have to tell to Professor again that I was still there during the bomb war in 1992 when the British bombed Berlin. And I always rejoiced when an SS headquarters went up in flames or even some other building. But when they bombed the Berlin Staatstheater with the Opera House, I didn't forgive them. That was my opera house. You can't just bomb. I mean, that's uncouth. It's just not fair. Well, anyhow, I just jokingly tell that. But it's a beautiful city, but it's too far away now. I don't think I still read the Berlin newspaper every night. They got the same problems over there that we have here.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you.